The dusty main street of Agua Caliente, Arizona stretched empty under the merciless June sun of 1878, and Katherine Vance stood at the edge of town with her father's rifle in her hands, watching a lone cowboy ride toward the distant mountains without looking back. She had been 17 then, all braided auburn hair and sun-browned skin, too tall for most of the local boys to look at twice and too smart to care. Her father ran the general store, and her mother had died bringing her into the world, a fact that the other women in town reminded her of with their pitying looks and whispered concerns about her unwomanly ways. Katherine could shoot better than most men, ride harder, and had no patience for embroidery circles or gossip. The cowboy had been named Miles Ventura, and he had worked at the Circle T Ranch for exactly 3 months before moving on. She remembered the first time she saw him, leading his buckskin mare down the street, his hat pulled low against the sun. He had stopped at her father's store for supplies, and when she handed him his change, their fingers had touched for just a moment. His eyes were the color of creek water in summer, green and clear and deep. That had been the beginning, though she had not known it then. Now, 11 years later in 1889, Katherine stood in front of that same general store, her father long buried and the business now hers. She was 28 years old, unmarried, and according to the town matrons, well past her prime. The Arizona territory had changed in those years. The railroad had come through, bringing more people, more trouble, and more noise. Agua Caliente had grown from a dusty collection of buildings into something approaching a real town, with a proper hotel, 2 saloons, and a church with a bell that rang every Sunday morning. But Katherine had not changed much at all. She still wore her hair in a single braid down her back, still kept her father's rifle behind the counter, and still had no interest in the suitable men who occasionally worked up the courage to court her. "You are going to die alone," her friend Sarah Martinez said one sweltering afternoon, fanning herself with a piece of cardboard while Katherine inventoried the new shipment of dry goods. "A woman your age should have children by now." "A woman my age should do whatever she pleases," Katherine replied, marking numbers in her ledger. "Besides, you have enough children for both of us." Sarah had 5, ranging from infant to 10 years old, and she looked perpetually exhausted. Children are a blessing. So is a full night's sleep. Sarah laughed despite herself, then sobered. "I worry about you, Kate. What will happen when you are old? Who will take care of you?" "I will take care of myself, same as always." That conversation might have been the end of it, except that the next morning, Katherine woke to find that her prized mare, Copper, had broken through the fence during the night and wandered off. She discovered this at dawn when she went to feed the animals and found the corral gate swinging open, splintered wood showing where the horse had kicked through. "Damn it all," Katherine muttered, pulling on her boots and grabbing her riding jacket. She saddled her older gelding, Buck, and set out to track the mare before the sun got too high. The trail led north, toward the foothills where the desert began to give way to scrub pine and juniper. Copper's tracks were clear in the soft earth, and Katherine followed them easily enough, though she grew increasingly concerned as the trail led farther from town. This was rough country, full of rattlesnakes and mountain lions, and while Copper was smart for a horse, she was still just a horse. The sun climbed higher, turning the air thick and hot. Katherine stopped twice to water Buck and take a drink herself from her canteen. She was beginning to think she might need to turn back and organize a proper search party when she crested a ridge and saw something that made her pull Buck to a halt. There, in a small valley formed by 3 rocky hills, stood an old line shack she had never seen before. It was weathered and listing slightly to one side, but smoke rose from the chimney, meaning someone was home. And there, in the makeshift corral beside the shack, stood Copper, calmly eating hay alongside two other horses. Catherine's first instinct was relief. Her second was caution. She loosened the pistol at her hip and urged Buck forward slowly. She was halfway to the shack when the door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in this harsh landscape. He wore dusty work clothes and a battered hat, and when he looked up at her approach, Katherine felt something twist in her chest. Even after 11 years, she knew him immediately. Miles Ventura looked older, his face more weathered, with lines around his eyes and a few days' worth of stubble on his jaw. But those eyes were the same impossible green, and they widened with recognition as she rode closer. "Katherine Vance," he said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered it, low and rough like wind over sand. "That is a name I have not heard in a long time." She dismounted, her heart hammering in a way that annoyed her. "Miles Ventura, I am here for my horse, the red mare. She came wandering in last night. I was going to bring her into town today, but I figured she belonged to the Circle T." He paused, studying her. "You are running the ranch now." "I am running my father's store," Katherine said stiffly. "The mare is mine." Something flickered across his face. "Your father, I heard about his passing. I am sorry." "It was 3 years ago. I have been away." The silence stretched between them, full of questions neither seemed willing to ask. Finally, Miles walked to the corral and opened the gate. Copper came to Katherine immediately, nuzzling her shoulder as if apologizing for the trouble. Katherine ran her hands over the mare's legs, checking for injuries, and found none. "She is fine," Miles said. "Just thirsty and hungry when she arrived. I fed her well." "Thank you." Katherine began leading Copper toward Buck, intending to tie the horses together for the ride back. "Wait." She turned, and Miles was standing closer than she expected, close enough that she could see the exact pattern of green and gold in his eyes. "How have you been?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that made the question more than just politeness. "Busy. The store keeps me occupied. No husband, no children." The bluntness of it surprised her into honesty. "No, you." "No." He looked away toward the mountains. "I have been traveling. Working different ranches. Came back to Arizona about 6 months ago." "Why?" He met her eyes again, and Katherine felt that same jolt she had felt 11 years ago, stronger now, more dangerous. "Unfinished business." Before she could ask what he meant, he continued. "There is a place I want to show you, if you have time before heading back." Every practical instinct told her to refuse, to mount up and ride back to town where things made sense. Instead, she heard herself say, "All right." Miles saddled his own horse, a big roan gelding, and led her up a narrow trail that wound between the rocky hills. They did not speak, but Katherine was intensely aware of him riding just ahead, the way he sat his horse, the strength in his shoulders. She forced herself to focus on the landscape instead, noting the way the desert plants gave way to scattered trees as they climbed higher. After about 20 minutes, they emerged into a small clearing dominated by a single, massive cottonwood tree. It stood ancient and gnarled, its branches spreading wide to provide a circle of precious shade. A tiny spring bubbled up from between the rocks nearby, creating a pool no bigger than a wash basin before disappearing back into the earth. "I found this place when I worked at the Circle T," Miles said, dismounting. "Used to come here when I needed to think." Katherine slid down from Buck's back, her boots crunching on the dry grass. The shade was blissfully cool after the harsh sun, and the sound of trickling water was almost musical in the silence. Miles walked to the cottonwood and placed his hand against the trunk. "Come here." She approached, curious despite herself. He stepped aside and she saw what he wanted her to see. Carved into the bark, weathered but still legible, were two sets of initials inside a rough heart. MV plus KV. Katherine stopped breathing. "I did this the night before I left," Miles said quietly. 11 years ago. I carved your name into this tree because I was a coward who could not tell you the truth to your face." She stared at the carving, her mind racing. "What truth?" "That I was in love with you." The words fell into the quiet like stones into water. "That I had been in love with you since the first time you laughed at one of my stupid jokes in your father's store. That I left because I was a drifter with nothing to offer, and you deserved better than a man who could not even keep himself fed half the time." Katherine reached out and traced the letters with her fingertips. The bark was rough, the carving deep. He had meant this to last. "You never said anything." "I was 23 and proud and stupid. I thought leaving was the noble thing to do." "It was not noble," she said, and her voice came out harder than she intended. "It was cowardly. You should have given me the choice." "I know." He moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "That is why I came back. I spent 11 years trying to forget you, Katherine Vance. Worked ranches in Colorado, Wyoming, even up in Montana for a spell. Saved every penny I could. And the whole time, all I could think about was those 3 months in Agua Caliente and the girl who looked at me like I might be worth something." She turned to face him, and the vulnerability in his expression nearly undid her. "I was 17. I know. Too young for me to court properly. That was another reason I left. And now you are a grown woman who can make her own choices, and I am a man who finally has something to offer. I bought land, 50 acres about 5 miles south of here, got a good well, decent grazing. I have been building a house." He took a breath. "I came back to see if maybe, possibly, you might consider letting me court you properly this time." Katherine's heart was thundering so hard she was sure he could hear it. 11 years of telling herself she did not need anyone, that she was content alone. 11 years of wondering why no man in Agua Caliente made her feel anything more than mild irritation. And here was the answer, standing in front of her with hope and fear written clearly across his weathered face. "I am 28 years old," she said. "Set in my ways. I run a business. I do not cook well, I do not sew, and I have no interest in learning. I speak my mind, I keep my own counsel, and I will not be told what to do." "I know all that," Miles said. "That is why I love you." The simple honesty of it broke something open inside her. She closed the distance between them and kissed him, her hands fisting in his shirt. 11 years of wondering and waiting poured into that single contact. He made a surprised sound against her mouth. Then his arms came around her, strong and sure, and kissed her back with a fervor that made her knees weak. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Miles rested his forehead against hers. "Is that a yes to courting?" "That is a yes," Katherine said, and laughed at the pure joy that lit up his face. They stood there in the shade of the cottonwood for a long time, holding each other while the spring sang its small song and the horses grazed peacefully nearby. Finally, practical concerns reasserted themselves and Katherine pulled back reluctantly. "I need to get back to town, the store." "I will ride with you," Miles hesitated. "Katherine, I want to do this right. May I call on you? Take you to dinner at the hotel, you may." She paused. "But Miles, people will talk. An unmarried woman my age being courted by a stranger." "I am not a stranger, and I do not give a damn what people say." "Neither do I," she admitted. "I just wanted you to know what you are getting into." He grinned, and it transformed his whole face, making him look years younger. "Darling, I have spent 11 years getting into this. I am not backing out now." The ride back to Agua Caliente took on a dreamlike quality. Miles rode beside her, and they talked the way they had 11 years ago, easily and without pretense. He told her about his years of wandering, the ranches he had worked, the money he had saved. She told him about her father's slow decline, the pneumonia that had finally taken him, the struggle of running the store alone. "You could have married," Miles said. "Made it easier on yourself." "I could have," Katherine agreed, "but I did not want easy, I wanted mine." He looked at her with such warmth that she felt it like sunshine on her skin. "You are remarkable. I am practical. Those are not mutually exclusive." They reached the edge of town as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Katherine could already see curtains twitching in windows, faces appearing to watch them ride down the main street together. She held her head high and ignored them all. At the store, Miles helped her settle Copper back in the corral, checking the fence and repairing the broken boards with practiced efficiency. Katherine watched him work, admiring the competence in his movements, the way he handled the tools like extensions of his own hands. "Will you come for dinner tomorrow?" she asked when he finished. "I may not cook well, but I can manage a decent stew." "I would be honored." He paused, his hand on his horse's reins. "Katherine, I meant what I said. I am here to stay. I am not running any more." "Good," she said firmly. "Because if you break my heart again, I will shoot you." He laughed, but there was relief in his eyes. "Fair enough." She watched him ride out of town, heading south toward his land, and allowed herself to smile. Sarah was going to have a field day with this. Sarah appeared at the store the next morning before Katherine had even finished sweeping the front porch. "Tell me everything," she demanded, slightly out of breath from hurrying over. "Martha Reynolds saw you riding back into town with a strange man yesterday, and the whole town is buzzing." Katherine continued sweeping. "His name is Miles Ventura. He worked at the Circle T 11 years ago. He is back now, bought land south of town. And he is courting me." Sarah's squeal probably woke half the town. "Katherine, this is wonderful. Tell me what he looks like. Is he handsome?" "What does he do?" "He is a rancher. And yes, I suppose he is handsome." Katherine could feel heat rising in her cheeks. "You suppose?" Sarah grabbed her arm. "Kate, you are blushing. I have never seen you blush in my entire life. Do not make a fuss." "I am absolutely making a fuss. My best friend is finally being courted. Does he make you happy?" Katherine stopped sweeping and met Sarah's eyes. "Yes, he does." Sarah's expression softened. "Then I am happy for you. When do I get to meet him properly?" "He is coming for dinner tonight." "Tonight, Kate, you cannot cook." "I am aware of that. Thank you very much." In the end, Sarah took pity on her and spent the afternoon helping Katherine prepare a meal that would not poison anyone. They made beef stew with vegetables from Sarah's garden, fresh bread, and a dried apple pie that Sarah swore was foolproof. Katherine cleaned the small living quarters behind the store until everything gleamed, then changed into her best dress, a simple blue cotton that Sarah insisted brought out her eyes. "You look beautiful," Sarah said, adjusting Katherine's collar. "Truly." "I look the same as always." "No, you do not. You look happy. It makes a difference." Miles arrived exactly on time, cleaned up and wearing a shirt that looked new. He brought wildflowers, a casual bunch of desert blooms that he had clearly picked himself, and the gesture touched Katherine more than expensive roses would have. Dinner was surprisingly easy. Miles charmed Sarah within 5 minutes, asking about her children and listening with genuine interest to her stories. He complimented the food, helped clear the dishes, and generally proved himself to be exactly the kind of man any mother in town would want for her daughter. After Sarah left, Miles stayed to help Katherine finish cleaning up. They worked in comfortable silence, and Katherine marveled at how natural it felt to have him in her space. "Your friend is nice," Miles said, drying the last plate. "She is. Probably the only person in town who has never judged me for my choices. Then she is a good friend to have." He set the plate down and turned to face her. "Katherine, I want to be clear about my intentions. I am not interested in a long courtship. I am 34 years old and I have wasted enough time already. I want to marry you, build a life with you, but I will wait as long as you need me to." The directness should have startled her, but instead, Katherine felt a calm certainty settle over her. "I do not need a long courtship either. I have known my own mind since I was 15 years old. What I need is to know that you will not leave again. I give you my word." He took her hands in his calloused palms warm against hers. "I will be here, Katherine. For better or worse, sickness and health, all of it, I will be here." "Then ask me," he blinked. "Now, why not now? You said yourself we have wasted enough time." A slow smile spread across his face. He dropped to one knee right there in her tiny kitchen, still holding her hands. "Katherine Vance, will you marry me?" "Yes." The word came out steady and sure. "Yes, I will marry you." He stood and kissed her, deep and slow, and Katherine felt something settle into place inside her, like a puzzle piece finally finding its home. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church, with Sarah and her family as witnesses and half the town in attendance, drawn by curiosity as much as goodwill. Katherine wore a simple cream-colored dress and carried more of Miles's wildflowers. The ceremony was short, the words binding, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Miles kissed her with such tenderness that several of the town matrons dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The reception was held at the hotel, and Katherine was surprised by how many people seemed genuinely happy for her. Even some of the women who had previously whispered about her spinsterhood came to offer congratulations and advice. "You are a lucky woman, Mrs. Henderson said, watching Miles laugh at something Sarah's husband had said. "He looks at you like you hung the moon." Katherine followed her gaze and found Miles looking back at her across the crowded room. The warmth in his eyes made her breath catch. "I am lucky," she agreed. As the evening wore on, Katherine grew tired of the noise and the attention. She caught Miles's eye and tilted her head toward the door. He understood immediately, making their excuses and guiding her outside into the cool night air. "Where are we going?" Katherine asked as he helped her into the wagon he had driven into town. "Home," Miles said simply. Home turned out to be the house he had been building on his land. Katherine had not seen it yet, and as they approached in the darkness, lit only by moonlight and the lantern swinging from the wagon, she felt a flutter of nervousness. It was a good-sized house, bigger than she had expected, with a wide porch and real glass windows. Inside, Miles lit lamps to reveal solid furniture, clean floors, and rooms that still smelled of fresh lumber and paint. "I know it is not much yet," he said, watching her take it all in, "but I wanted it to be ready for you, for us." Katherine walked through the main room, the kitchen, the bedroom with its large bed and handmade quilt. Everything was simple but well made, built with care and attention to detail. In the bedroom, she found a surprise. A beautiful wooden trunk at the foot of the bed, carved with flowers and vines. "I made that for you," Miles said from the doorway. "For your things." She ran her fingers over the smooth wood, the intricate carving. "It is beautiful. You did this yourself. Spent the winter working on it. Wanted to give you something special." Katherine turned to face him, her husband, and felt emotion well up in her throat. "Miles Ventura, you are a good man. I try to be." He crossed to her, cupping her face in his hands. "I want to make you happy, Kate. That is all I have ever wanted." "You do," she whispered. "You make me very happy." Their wedding night was tender and sweet, full of whispered words and gentle touches. Miles was patient, careful, making sure she felt safe and cherished. And when Katherine finally fell asleep in his arms, She felt more at peace than she had in 11 years. The next months passed in a blur of adjustment and joy. Katherine kept the store, rising early to make the ride into town and returning each evening to the ranch. Miles worked his land, building fences and breaking horses, slowly turning his 50 acres into a working operation. They fell into routines, learning each other's rhythms, negotiating the small compromises that all marriages require. It was not always easy. Katherine was used to making her own decisions, and Miles had lived alone for so long that he sometimes forgot to consult her about changes he wanted to make. They had their first real fight about a month after the wedding, when Miles bought a dozen head of cattle without telling her. "We needed breeding stock," he argued, his jaw set stubbornly. "That is not the point. The point is that you used our money for a major purchase without discussing it with me first. Our money. I earned that money working the Nelson Ranch. And I have money from the store. We are married, Miles. What is yours is mine, and what is mine is yours. That means we make big decisions together." He stared at her for a long moment, then his shoulders sagged. "You are right. I am sorry. I am not used to having a partner." "Well, get used to it," Katherine said, but her voice was softer. "I am not going anywhere." He pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly. "I will do better," he promised against her hair. "I want this to work, Kate. I want us to work." "We will," she said, "but you have to talk to me. No more secrets, no more running off to carve my name in trees instead of speaking your mind." He laughed, and the tension broke. "No more secrets," he agreed. They made up thoroughly, and the next day Miles took her to see the cattle. Katherine had to admit they were fine animals, and the calves they would produce would indeed help build the ranch into something profitable. As autumn turned to winter, Katherine discovered she was pregnant. She knew before she missed her monthly courses, knew from the way her body felt different changed. When she told Miles, he picked her up and spun her around, whooping with joy. "A baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a baby." "Put me down before you make me sick," Katherine said, but she was laughing. He set her down carefully, then immediately became anxious. "Should you still be riding into town every day? Is that safe? Maybe you should sell the store. I am pregnant, not dying." Women have been having babies since the beginning of time while doing far more strenuous things than riding a horse. "I will be fine." But as her pregnancy progressed, Katherine did find herself growing more tired. By the time winter settled in properly, she had hired young Tom Baker to help run the store, giving her more time to rest at home. Miles fussed over her constantly, making sure she ate enough, did not lift anything heavy, stayed warm. "I am going to smother you in your sleep if you do not stop hovering," Katherine warned one evening as Miles tried to put extra pillows behind her back for the third time. "I just want you to be comfortable." "I am comfortable. What I am not comfortable with is being treated like fragile china." Miles sat back, chagrined. "I am sorry. I am nervous, I suppose. I want everything to be perfect." Katherine's irritation melted. She took his hand and placed it on her swollen belly. "Do you feel that? The baby kicking," his face transformed with awe. "Yes, that is amazing. That is real. This baby is real, and it is coming whether we fuss or not. So maybe we should just try to enjoy this time, He leaned in and kissed her, soft and sweet. "You are right. As usual. Remember that." The baby came in early April, arriving during a spring rainstorm that turned the roads to mud. Sarah came to help along with the midwife, and Miles paced outside for hours while Katherine labored. It was hard, painful work, and there were moments when Katherine wondered if she would survive it. But Sarah held her hand and talked her through it, and just after dawn, a baby's cry split the air. "A boy," the midwife announced, placing the squalling infant in Katherine's arms. "A healthy baby boy." Miles burst through the door moments later, his face pale with worry. "Kate, are you all right?" "I am fine." She was exhausted, sweaty, and sore, but holding her son, she had never felt more triumphant. "Come meet your son." He approached almost reverently, staring down at the tiny, red-faced baby. "He is so small. He will grow." Katherine looked down at her son, marveling at his perfect fingers, the downy dark hair on his head. "What should we name him?" "Matthew," Miles said immediately, "after my father, if that is all right with you." "Matthew Ventura." Katherine tried it out and smiled. "I like it. Hello, Matthew." Welcome to the world. The first year of Matthew's life passed in an exhausted blur. Katherine had never known it was possible to be so tired, so overwhelmed, and so completely in love all at once. Miles proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with Matthew when he cried at night, changing diapers without complaint, and talking to the baby in a soft, gentle voice that made Katherine's heart squeeze with affection. The ranch prospered. Miles's cattle multiplied, and he sold several horses he had trained for good prices. Katherine eventually sold the store to Tom Baker, deciding she would rather focus on building the ranch with Miles than splitting her time between two demanding jobs. It was a hard decision, giving up the business her father had built, but Tom was a good man who promised to honor its legacy. When Matthew was 2, Katherine got pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to do. Their daughter arrived in winter, a tiny, fierce thing with Katherine's auburn hair and Miles's green eyes. "What about Kathleen?" Miles suggested, looking down at his daughter with besotted wonder. "Absolutely not. I will not have her cursed with my name." Katherine thought for a moment. "How about Ruth, after my mother?" Miles's eyes softened. "Ruth. That is beautiful." Life settled into a rhythm. Seasons of planting and harvest, cattle drives and horse training, children growing and learning. Matthew proved to be quiet and thoughtful, while Ruth was adventurous and bold. They were 4 and 2 when Sarah's oldest son asked Katherine if it was true that Miles had carved her name in a tree before they were married. "Who told you that?" Katherine asked, surprised. "My ma. She said it was the most romantic thing she ever heard." Katherine looked at Miles across their dinner table, their children between them, and saw him trying not to grin. "It is true," she said, "though your ma might be exaggerating about the romantic part." "I do not know," Miles said. "I thought it was pretty romantic." "You thought leaving without saying goodbye was romantic." "No, coming back was romantic. The tree was just insurance in case you needed convincing." Ruth, too young to understand but wanting to be included, piped up. "What tree?" "I will show you someday," Miles promised. He kept that promise on Matthew's 8th birthday. They made a family trip to the cottonwood tree, riding out in the early morning with a picnic lunch packed. The tree was as Katherine remembered it, ancient and enduring, though the carving had weathered even more with time. "See there." Miles pointed to the faded initials. "MV plus KV, that stands for your ma and me." Matthew traced the carving carefully. "You put her name in a tree." "I did. Because I loved her, and I wanted something to last even if I could not find the courage to tell her myself." "That is silly," Ruth declared. "You should have just told her." Miles laughed and scooped his daughter up. "You are absolutely right. I was young and foolish." "But you came back," Matthew said quietly. "That is what matters, right? You came back and told her the truth." Katherine met Miles's eyes over their children's heads, and the love she saw there still had the power to steal her breath, even after all these years. "That is exactly what matters," she said. They had their picnic in the shade of the cottonwood, the spring still bubbling its small song. Matthew wanted to know everything about how his parents met, and Miles obliged, telling stories that made Katherine blush and the children laugh. Ruth fell asleep against Catherine's shoulder, and Matthew lay on his back watching clouds drift past through the branches. "This is a good place," Matthew said drowsily. "It feels special." "It is special," Miles agreed. "This is where your ma and I really began, where we both finally understood what we meant to each other." That night, after the children were asleep, Katherine and Miles sat on their porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. These were Katherine's favorite moments, the quiet times when they could just be together without the demands of children or ranch work. "You ever regret it?" Miles asked. "Giving up the store, marrying me this life?" Katherine considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I wonder what might have been if I had made different choices. But regret? No, never. Even with how stubborn I can be, especially because of how stubborn you can be. We are well matched in that regard." She leaned against him, his arm coming around her shoulders automatically. "What about you? Do you regret coming back?" "Not for a single second. Coming back to you was the bravest, smartest thing I ever did." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "I wasted so many years convinced I was not good enough for you. I wish I could go back and tell my younger self what a fool I was being. You were young. We both were. You knew your own mind at 17. I did, but you needed time to find yours. We got here eventually. That is what matters." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the desert, coyotes calling in the distance, the rustle of some small creature in the brush, the soft lowing of cattle settling down for the night. "Miles," Katherine said eventually. Thank you. For the tree, for coming back, for all of it." He turned to look at her, his expression tender in the starlight. "Loving you is the easiest thing I have ever done, Kate. I should be thanking you for taking a chance on a drifter cowboy with more pride than sense." "Well, you did have excellent timing. Another year or two and I might have given up on men entirely and become one of those eccentric old women with too many cats." He laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "The world's loss, but I am grateful I saved it from that fate." She swatted his arm, but she was smiling. They stayed out until the air grew cool, then went inside to their bed, their home, their life. The years continued to pass, marked by the steady rhythm of ranch life. Matthew grew tall and serious, inheriting his father's way with horses. Ruth remained wild and fearless, more at home on horseback than anywhere else. When Matthew was 12 and Ruth 10, Katherine gave birth to another son, Samuel, a surprise late baby who arrived with a lusty cry and an appetite that astounded everyone. 3 children, Miles said, holding tiny Samuel while Matthew and Ruth peered at their new brother with fascination. "We are outnumbered." "You are just figuring that out now?" Katherine asked from the bed, tired but happy. The ranch had grown too. They now ran 100 head of cattle, and Miles's horse training operation had gained a reputation throughout the territory. They had hired 2 hands to help with the work, good men who Miles trusted. The original house had been expanded, adding more bedrooms and a proper dining room. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Miles had a surprise for Katherine. He woke her early, before the children were up, and rode with her back to the cottonwood tree. This time, he had brought a chisel and mallet. "What are you doing?" Katherine asked as he began working on the tree trunk. "Adding to our story," he said. When he finished, there were 2 dates carved below the original heart, their wedding date and the current date with the number 10 between them. Below that, he had carved Matthew, Ruth, and Samuel's names. "Now the tree tells our whole story," Miles said, stepping back to admire his work. "Where we started and where we have been." Katherine felt tears prick her eyes. "It is perfect." He pulled her close, and they stood together in the shade of the tree that had witnessed their beginning. "I love you, Katherine Ventura. More every day, if that is possible." "It is possible," she whispered, "because I feel the same way. Life on the ranch was not always easy. There were years of drought when the cattle suffered and money grew tight. There was the year Ruth broke her arm falling from a horse, and the terrifying hours before they knew she would be fine. There was the winter Matthew caught pneumonia, and Miles and Katherine took turns sitting up with him for 3 days until the fever broke. But there were good times, too. There was the summer they all went to the territorial fair in Tucson, and Ruth won a blue ribbon for her riding. There was Matthew's first cattle drive. How proud he looked sitting tall in the saddle alongside his father. There was the time Samuel, at age 4, decided to help train the horses and ended up covered head to toe in mud. Through it all, Katherine and Miles remained each other's constants. They argued sometimes, usually about small things made large by exhaustion or stress. But they always worked it out, talking through their problems like the partners they had promised to be. On their 20th anniversary, the whole family rode out to the cottonwood tree. Matthew was 22 now, working the ranch alongside his father. Ruth was 20, engaged to a neighboring rancher's son. Samuel was 10, all gangly limbs and endless energy. Miles added another carving to the tree, and this time the children helped, taking turns with the chisel. They added dates, memories, inside jokes that only their family would understand. By the time they were done, the trunk of the cottonwood was covered with the story of their family. "This tree is going to fall down if we keep carving on it," Ruth said, laughing. "Then we will find another tree," Miles said, "but I do not think we need to worry. This old cottonwood has been here longer than any of us. It will be here long after we are gone." The thought sobered them all for a moment. Katherine looked at her family, her husband's arm around her waist, her grown children and her young son, and felt overwhelmed by gratitude. She had built a good life, against all odds and expectations. That winter, Sarah's husband died of a heart attack, sudden and shocking. Katherine was there for her friend through the grief, just as Sarah had been there for her through the years. At the funeral, Sarah gripped Katherine's hand tightly. "You were right," Sarah said quietly. "All those years ago when I said you would die alone, you were right to wait for the right man. I would rather have had 20 good years with my husband than 40 bad ones with someone else." "You will be all right," Katherine assured her. "Your children will help you, I know. But Kate, I am scared. I do not know how to do this alone." Katherine squeezed her hand. "You do not have to be alone. You have family, you have friends, you have me." Sarah came to stay at the ranch for a few weeks while she sorted out her husband's affairs. Miles was endlessly patient, giving the two women space to talk and cry and remember. Matthew helped Sarah's oldest son manage the farm. It was what neighbors did, what family did. When Sarah finally went back to her own home, she hugged Katherine fiercely. "Thank you for everything, for being the sister I never had." "Always," Katherine promised. Life continued its relentless forward march. Ruth married her rancher in a beautiful ceremony, and a year later, she gave Katherine and Miles their first grandchild, a girl she named Katherine Sarah. Matthew married the schoolteacher, a smart, kind woman named Elizabeth, and they settled in a house on the far edge of the ranch property. Samuel, at 18, announced he wanted to study law and moved to Tucson for school. Katherine worried about him in the city, but Miles reminded her that they had raised their children to be independent and strong. "He will be fine," Miles said, "and he will come home when he is ready." On their 30th anniversary, Miles and Katherine made the trip to the cottonwood tree alone. They were both moving slower now, their joints stiff with age, but they made the journey like they had countless times before. The tree stood eternal and patient, its trunk a palimpsest of their life together. Miles pulled out his carving tools, but this time Katherine stopped him. "Let me," she said. she carved carefully, adding the number 30 to their collection of anniversaries. Her hands were not as steady as they used to be, but she managed it, stepping back to admire her work. 30 years, Miles said wonderingly. Seems impossible. Seems right, Katherine corrected. She turned to face him, this man who had ridden into her life twice and changed everything. His hair was silver now, his face deeply lined, but his green eyes were the same. I would do it all again, every moment. Even the parts where I was stubborn and impossible, especially those parts. They made the good times sweeter. He kissed her, slow and tender with all the practice of 3 decades together. When they finally pulled apart, Katherine rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. We should head back, Miles said eventually. Elizabeth is making supper, and you know how she gets if we are late. Always so practical, Katherine teased. I learned from the best. They rode back to the ranch as the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The house rose out of the landscape like a promise kept, lights in the windows welcoming them home. Their children and grandchildren were waiting, and there would be food and laughter, and the comfortable chaos of family. But Katherine took a moment to look back toward the hills, toward the cottonwood trees standing guard over their history. Tomorrow there would be work to do, cattle to tend, a ranch to run. Tomorrow there would be the small joys and large worries that came with being part of a big, sprawling family. But tonight, riding beside her husband under the vast Arizona sky, Katherine felt nothing but contentment. She had built a life worth living, with a man worth loving. What more could anyone ask for? The years accumulated like rings in a tree, each one adding depth and character to their story. Katherine's hair went white, and Miles developed a limp from an old riding injury that bothered him in cold weather. They were grandparents 5 times over, with Samuel eventually marrying and adding to the count. The ranch continued to thrive under Matthew's management, though Miles still insisted on helping with the horse training. Katherine spent her days tending her garden, visiting with Sarah, and spoiling her grandchildren with the kind of indulgence she had never allowed herself with her own children. On their 40th anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There were children running everywhere, 3 generations of Venturas filling the house with noise and love. Ruth's daughter Katherine, now a young woman of 19, cornered her grandmother in the kitchen. "Grandma, is it true Grandpa carved your name in a tree before you were even married?" Katherine smiled, wrapping her bread dough. "It is true." "That is so romantic. Did you know about it?" "Not for 11 years. I found it quite by accident when I was tracking a lost horse." Young Katherine's eyes widened. 11 years. He waited 11 years. No, he ran away for 11 years. Then he came back and showed me the tree. Katherine punched down the dough with perhaps more force than necessary, remembering. "Your grandfather was many things, but patient was not always one of them. But you forgave him." "I did. Because he came back and he stayed. That is what matters in the end, not the mistakes we make along the way, but whether we are willing to make things right." The girl thought about this, her young face serious. "I hope I find someone like that someday." "I hope you do too, sweetness. But do not settle for less than you deserve. Better to be alone and happy than together and miserable." That evening, after the younger children had been put to bed, and the older ones were playing cards in the parlor, Miles and Katherine slipped away to the porch. It had become their habit over the years, these quiet moments together at the end of the day. "That was a good party," Miles said, settling into his rocking chair with a satisfied sigh. "It was. Though I think Ruth's youngest ate himself sick on cake. He is young. He will learn." They rocked in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge. Katherine reached over and took Miles's hand, their fingers interlacing automatically after so many years of practice. "Miles," she said softly, "thank you for coming back, all those years ago, for being brave enough to try again." He squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you for giving me a chance, for seeing something worth loving in a foolish drifter. You were never foolish, maybe uncertain, maybe a little lost, but never foolish. I was foolish enough to leave you the first time, and wise enough to come back. That is what I choose to remember." They stayed out until the night grew cold, then went inside to their bed. Katherine fell asleep quickly, lulled by exhaustion and contentment, but Miles lay awake a while longer, studying his wife's face in the moonlight that filtered through the window. He thought about the young man he had been, riding away from Agua Caliente with his heart breaking and his pride intact. He thought about the years of wandering, working different ranches, saving every penny, and dreaming of auburn hair and sharp wit. He thought about the day he rode back, terrified she would have married someone else, that it would be too late, and he thought about finding her still there, still herself, still somehow free. About showing her the tree, laying his heart bare, and watching her face transform with understanding. "I love you, Kate," he whispered, knowing she could not hear but needing to say it anyway. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." She stirred in her sleep, moving closer to him, and Miles wrapped his arm around her, holding her safe the way he had for 40 years. The seasons turned. Spring brought new calves and the exhausting work of branding. Summer brought scorching heat and the constant worry about water. Fall brought cattle drives and the satisfaction of successful sales. Winter brought cold nights and the luxury of rest. Katherine's health began to fail when she was 72. Nothing dramatic, just a gradual slowing, a tiredness that rest did not cure. The doctor said her heart was wearing out, which struck Miles as both medically accurate and poetically fitting. Katherine had given her heart fully to so many people for so many years. Of course it would eventually exhaust itself. She took the news with characteristic pragmatism. "Well, I have had a good run, better than most." "Do not talk like that," Miles said fiercely. "You are not going anywhere." "I am not planning to leave tomorrow, but Miles, we have to be realistic. I am old, you are old, and our time is not infinite." He hated it, but he knew she was right. They had been blessed with more years than many couples got. That did not make the thought of losing her any easier to bear. Katherine spent that summer putting her affairs in order with quiet efficiency. She made sure all the grandchildren had something special from her, distributed her mother's jewelry, and wrote letters to each of her children expressing her love and pride. Miles watched her prepare for the inevitable and felt his heart break a little more each day, but she rallied in the fall, regaining some of her strength and energy. The doctor said it was not uncommon, these temporary improvements. Miles chose to see it as a gift, extra time he had not expected. On a crisp October morning, Katherine announced she wanted to visit the cottonwood tree one more time. "Kate, you are not strong enough for that ride," Miles protested. "Then we will take the wagon and go slowly. Please, Miles, I need to see it again." He could not refuse her anything, not after all these years. They made the trip with Matthew driving the wagon and Elizabeth packing enough supplies for a small army. The journey that had once taken less than an hour now took most of the morning, with frequent stops to rest. But finally, they arrived at the clearing, and there stood the cottonwood, ancient and enduring as ever. Matthew helped Katherine down from the wagon, and she walked slowly to the tree, running her hands over the carved trunk. 42 years of marriage were recorded there, along with the names of children, grandchildren, anniversaries, and inside jokes. The tree had been their witness, their confidant, their historian. "It is still here," Katherine said wonderingly, "still standing." "Like you," Miles said, coming to stand beside her. Weathered but enduring. She smiled at that. I am more weathered than enduring these days. They spent the afternoon in the shade of the cottonwood, talking about their life together, remembering the good times and the hard times. Matthew and Elizabeth gave them privacy, setting up the picnic at a respectful distance. As the sun began to lower, Katherine stood and pulled Miles's carving tools from her bag. He had not even realized she had brought them. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Adding one more thing." She carved slowly, her hands shaking but her will determined. When she finished, she stepped back so he could see, below everything else she had carved two words: "Forever us." Miles felt tears burn his eyes. "Kate, I want whoever finds this tree in 100 years to know," she said. "To know that we were here, that we loved each other, that it was real and true and forever." He pulled her into his arms, holding her as gently as if she were made of glass. "Forever us," he repeated. "I promise." They made it back to the ranch as darkness fell. Katherine was exhausted, and Miles carried her to their bed over her protests. "I can walk," she grumbled. "I know you can. Let me do this anyway." She fell asleep almost immediately, and Miles sat beside her, watching her breathe, counting each rise and fall of her chest like precious jewels. Katherine had one more good month. She saw her youngest grandchild turn 3, taught Ruth's daughter her recipe for apple pie, and spent hours sitting on the porch with Sarah, two old women remembering their lives. She died on a Sunday morning in late November, slipping away peacefully in her sleep with Miles holding her hand. One moment she was there, and the next she was simply gone, as quietly as she had done everything else in her life. The funeral was large, full of family and friends and neighbors whose lives Katherine had touched. Miles stood beside her grave and listened to the preacher talk about her goodness, her strength, her generous heart. It was all true, but it did not capture the fullness of who she had been. After everyone else had left, Miles stayed behind. He stood looking at the fresh earth, the simple headstone that read Katherine Ventura, beloved wife, mother, and friend, and felt hollowed out, scraped raw. "I do not know how to do this without you," he said to the grave, to the wind, to the empty air. "You were my compass, Kate, my true north. How do I find my way now?" There was no answer, of course. There never would be again. Miles went home to the ranch that felt too big and too quiet without her, and tried to figure out how to keep living. His children rallied around him, making sure he ate, that he was not alone too much. But they had their own lives, their own families, and eventually they had to step back and let him grieve in his own way. Miles found himself drawn to the cottonwood tree. He rode out there every week, sometimes more often, sitting in the shade and talking to Katherine as if she could hear him. He told her about the grandchildren, about the ranch, about the small details of life that he had always shared with her. "Ruth's youngest lost another tooth," he would say. "And Matthew is training a new mare that reminds me of Copper, stubborn and smart." Samuel wrote from Tucson. He is thinking about running for judge. Sometimes he cried. Sometimes he just sat in silence, his hand on the tree trunk, feeling connected to her through the wood that held their history. Winter passed and spring came, and Miles kept breathing, kept moving, kept living because he did not know what else to do. He was 80 years old, and he felt every single year. One afternoon in late May, young Katherine came to visit him. She was 25 now, married with a baby of her own. "Grandpa," she said, settling on the porch beside him with her infant daughter in her arms, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How do you keep going? After losing Grandma?" Miles looked at her, this girl named for his wife, and saw genuine concern in her eyes. "Some days I do not know. I wake up and I reach for her, and she is not there, and it feels like drowning. But then I think about what she would say if she could see me wallowing, and I get up anyway. What would she say?" she would tell me to stop being ridiculous and go check on the horses. She never had much patience for self-pity. Young Katherine smiled. That sounds like her. She would also tell me that love does not end just because someone dies, that she is still with me in everything we built together, in all of you. He reached out and gently touched the baby's soft head. What is her name? Rose Katherine. Miles felt his throat tighten. That is beautiful. They sat together in the afternoon sun, 3 generations bound by love and loss and the ongoing work of living. Miles survived another 2 years. He saw Rose take her first steps, watched Samuel get elected as a territorial judge, and danced at Matthew's 25th wedding anniversary. He carved the date of Katherine's death into the cottonwood tree, wanting their story to be complete. He died quietly one night in his sleep, his heart simply giving out at age 82. His children found him the next morning, peaceful in the bed he had shared with Katherine for so many years, a slight smile on his weathered face. They buried him beside Katherine, their graves side by side under the wide Arizona sky. The whole family gathered, along with what seemed like half the territory, to pay their respects to a man who had lived with integrity and loved with his whole heart. Matthew gave the eulogy, his voice steady despite his tears. My father once told me that the bravest thing he ever did was come back to Agua Caliente and tell my mother the truth about his feelings. He said it took him years to find that courage, but it was worth every moment of fear because it gave him a life with her. He taught us that love is a choice you make every day, and that real strength is not about never falling down, but about always getting back up. He will be missed more than words can say. After the service, the family gathered at the ranch house for the wake. There was food and tears and laughter as people shared their favorite stories about Miles. Ruth told about the time he tried to teach her to whistle, and they spent a whole afternoon making ridiculous noises. Samuel shared how his father had written him a letter every week while he was in law school, full of encouragement and terrible jokes. As evening fell and people began to leave, Matthew gathered his siblings. There is something we need to do. They rode out to the cottonwood tree together, the 3 children of Miles and Katherine, grown old themselves now. The tree stood as it always had, patient and eternal. Together, they carved one final message below their parents' story. Together again. Forever us. The tree became something of a legend over the years. Young couples would ride out to see it, to read the carved history of Miles and Katherine's love. Some started carving their own initials, adding their stories to the old cottonwood. The ranch stayed in the family for generations. Matthew's great-grandson eventually turned part of it into a heritage site, preserving the house and the history. But the cottonwood tree remained as it was, protected and honored as a monument to enduring love. On what would have been Miles and Katherine's 70th anniversary, the family held a celebration at the tree. Dozens of Venturas gathered, from infants to great-great-grandchildren, all descended from that stubborn storekeeper and the drifter Cowboy who had loved her enough to come back. Young Rose, now a woman in her 50s with children of her own, stood before the assembled family and told the story as it had been told to her. About the carving, the lost horse, the truth revealed. About a love that had endured through decades and beyond death. They taught us that love is patient and kind, she said, her hand on the weathered trunk. That it is worth fighting for, worth waiting for, worth everything. This tree is not just their story, it is all of our stories. It is about choosing love every day no matter how hard things get. The family sang together in the shade of the cottonwood, old hymns and folk songs that Miles and Katherine would have known. They shared a meal, told stories, and celebrated the legacy of two people who had lived ordinary lives made extraordinary by love. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, the cottonwood tree stood witness. Its branches swayed gently in the evening breeze, and if you listened carefully, you might almost hear the whisper of two voices, forever together, forever us. The end,